ready to go. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I'm very excited about this program, and particularly our two guests. I think you'll enjoy hearing from both of them and talking about this fascinating subject, which is ever more relevant in this era. We're going to start out with a 20-second video. Hold on just a sec. 20-second video, because I'll bet, other than the two guests, no one here knows what this is the anniversary of. And if you raise your hand, I'm not going to call on you, because I'm just going to assume that none of you know. Forget about it. This is the 55th anniversary, this very day, of a key speech that President Kennedy made that is still cited everywhere. I'm sorry to say, even in a Kentucky Fried Chicken commercial that's on now, without attributing the words to John F. Kennedy. So I encourage you all to boycott Kentucky Fried Chicken. You heard it here first. Please, 20 seconds.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept.
There's a longer clip of this, fortunately, that Stephen will show when his turn comes in just a moment. Let me put this particular program in context. This is the fifth in our series of legacy-related programs that the Center for Politics is conducting throughout 2017 to mark President Kennedy's 100th birthday, which actually was on May 29th, but the whole year is being devoted to it. And a lot of other events are coming up, particularly at the JFK Library, but we're having some in Charlottesville too. Next month, we have a new documentary that will begin airing on PBS stations across the country. As some of you know, we do a documentary with the PBS stations each year on some historical topic. We've done this for many, many years. We've done one on President Kennedy before called The Kennedy Half Century, which is, I understand, the title of a very good book that some of you might want to look into. But this is going to be the second one on President Kennedy. We hope to have the success with it we had with the first one. Again, some of you may not have heard that the Center for Politics has won 3 Emmys. I don't know how you could have missed it, because so many people have talked about it over the years, especially me. But this new documentary takes a fresh look at President Kennedy's life, administration, and legacy through some lesser known and even unknown stories. And we were fascinated to find out some of these. I think the library will be interested particularly in one. And the one in particular is reflected in the title, The House That Jack Built. The House That Jack Built. This will be on in October throughout the country, and we're also having 2 premieres, one in Richmond on October 4th and one here in Charlottesville on October 11th. If you'd like to come and you'd like to sign up for one of the premieres, please stop by our information table just outside for more details. Please show the short trailer. Just 2 months before he died, President John F. Kennedy said, "Things do not just happen, they are made to happen." At the time, the president hoped that he would be the one to shape the future of the nation. But assassins' bullets in Dallas changed all of that. So when and how do we fairly assess the short life of President Kennedy? The 100th anniversary of JFK's birth provides a good opportunity to try. Time cannot fully erase the inspiration created by his public words and deeds. They altered history, and they continue to be a source of fascination for new generations who didn't live during Kennedy's presidency. In many ways, JFK's success in life was partly of birthright, predestined by the power and privilege of the Kennedy family. But his birthright was just the cornerstone of his legacy. In the spring of 1936, a young JFK's health deteriorated. He had been studying at the London School of Economics, but had to come home.
They thought it might be jaundice, they thought it might be some other sort of disease, and it turned out it was Addison's disease.
A journalist friend of his father's suggested the J6 Ranch in Arizona as a place where Jack and his older brother Joe could both benefit from the warm, dry air and get into shape for the fall athletic season.
While they were here, they mended fences, they herded cattle,
but also they worked on building the office that Jack Speed, the owner of the ranch, had.
and they spent the whole summer on it pretty much. And Jack liked to call it the house that Jack built, because Jack Kennedy was the one that built the house.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Piece by piece, Jack Kennedy constructed his own unique legacy. And this is the house that Jack built. Some new photos in there. I really think you'll enjoy it when you see it, and we look forward to showing it to you. Now, to this evening's program. In 1957, in a time I remember well, Americans learned that the Soviet Union had launched the world's first man-made satellite, a 22-inch orb known as Sputnik. And believe it or not, I was 5. My dad took me out into the backyard one very dark night, and we saw it. It was a little tiny speck of light moving across the sky. And for 22 inches, it's amazing that you could see it without the aid of a telescope, but you could. And we were entranced and inspired by it, but also frightened by it, because it was the Soviet Union, and we knew what was coming. Inevitably, there would be weapons in space and all kinds of other things, which, of course, President Kennedy helped to deal with during his term. But there was an ensuing public panic, and it led to a crash program of upgrading mathematics and science teaching that led to the U.S. space program, in part. Following his election, President Kennedy prioritized the U.S. space program to keep pace with the Soviets. In 1961, President Kennedy told Congress that the nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out, or decade, as he said, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period, he added, will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. Kennedy's larger goal was to show the world that the United States was still the global leader in science, since developing nations might want to be aligned with the side demonstrating technological superiority. No one knew until many years later that President Kennedy had first suggested sending U.S. astronauts to Mars instead of the moon, a goal that we have achieved with robots, but not with men and women, though I'm sure the young people here in the room will see that during your lifetimes. I'm not that optimistic, but I know you will see it. Jim Webb, who's not our Jim Webb, who's a senator, but Jim Webb, the head of NASA, talked him out of it, recognizing that it was much more difficult to go to Mars than it was to go to the moon, which would be tough enough, as we learned. In the sweep of history, perhaps nothing JFK attained will matter more than his daring bet on NASA and a moon landing. It expanded man's horizons and led to earthbound breakthroughs in science, technology, communications, medicine, and consumer products of all sorts. Space exploration to come will always trace its roots to JFK's bold 1961 and 1962 declarations of intent. Tonight we'll reflect not just on the history, but also the future of this important legacy, and I'm delighted that we have two very distinguished guests to do that. We will get to our own University of Virginia graduate, our own Wahoo, Thomas Marshburn, here in just a moment, who is a real live astronaut and has flown in space. But first, I want to turn to someone I'm delighted to have a chance to welcome to the University of Virginia. Stephen Rothstein is the executive director of the JFK Library Foundation. He's an accomplished nonprofit administrator, public servant, and entrepreneur. He grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, the town where Kennedy was born, and spent much of his childhood. Prior to his current position, Mr. Rothstein served as CEO of Citizen Schools, a national nonprofit organization that partners with middle schools to expand the learning day for children in low-income communities. He spent 11 years as president of the world-renowned Perkins School for the Blind as well. Mr. Rothstein was also part of the founding team of Citizens Energy Corporation with Joseph P. Kennedy II. Citizens is the world's first nonprofit social mission oil company, assisting needy citizens in low-cost oil, natural gas, electricity, and pharmaceutical services. Having served on numerous nonprofit boards throughout his career, Rothstein is currently a director of the Brady Campaign and Brady Center for the Prevention of Gun Violence, and thank you very much for that. He graduated with honors from Williams College and received a Master's of Business Administration degree from Northeastern University. He and his wife, Susan Mays Rothstein, have 2 grown sons and reside now in Somerville, Massachusetts. As director of the JFK Library Foundation, Stephen has established digitization as one of his biggest priorities, and I know that all of us who are researchers in this field, the field of President Kennedy's life and legacy, are very grateful for what you have done, and you started this, and it will continue a long time in the future, and it will be wonderful for all researchers. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished guest, Mr. Stephen Rothstein. Stephen.
Thank you. That's very nice, and my mother would even believe it. So thank you for that kind words. And it's really a pleasure to be here. Obviously, UVA is a special place in terms of the Kennedy family and their participation here. Larry, you and your center and your colleagues, your amazing scholarship has done so much to move the field forward. What you're doing here, online, and teachers all over. So thank you for all of this. I had seen this preview before. You've even whet my appetite more. I can't wait to see the full thing when it's public. You're going to see some photos that are going on now. I'm not going to talk to the photos specifically. These are various photos of President Kennedy or John Glenn or Shepard, early space photos. Again, I'm happy to answer questions about them later, just to give a little more context. And I'm just going to spend another minute or two just filling in some of the things that Larry so eloquently talked about. You know, in 1957, when Sputnik went up, there was no NASA. And so Eisenhower decided as his response to establish NASA in 1958. During the campaign for presidency, John Kennedy talked about space, but in a very general way. He hadn't really formed the details of his vision. In fact, one of the bigger supporters early in the campaign, Lyndon Johnson, when he was in the Senate, he gave a speech to the Senate caucus prior to the campaign in 1958, and he said, the country that controls the space controls the world. And he very much didn't let Russia go ahead. Shortly after Kennedy was appointed, he named Jerome Wiesner, later became the head of MIT, as his science advisor. And Wiesner, in some of the first papers he gave to President Kennedy, advocated for a non-manned effort, that he thought technology, you could get a lot faster for the dollars that the country was willing to invest, and was going to go forward. Then, on April 12th, 1961, as Larry talked about, everything changed because of what Russia did and how they had Gurion go up in space, and he did a round-the-world orbit. And that excited and terrified the country. Russia, they closed schools for the day. They named a square after him. And so it really heightened attention. Kennedy had an emergency cabinet meeting later that week. And there was a big discussion about whether to go forward. And as Larry said, that he was told you'd really have to think about a Marshall Plan kind of initiative. And costing tens of billions. This was in the 60s when tens of billions was actually still a lot of money, and a number that they hadn't seen in a while. And then a few weeks later, Alan Shepard went up in Freedom 7. And by the way, if you ever do get to Boston, come to the Kennedy Library. I'd love you to come anyway. But the Freedom 7 capsule that Alan Shepard went up is at the library now. And to put it, for young people, to put it in context, so the Freedom 7 capsule that took Alan Shepard up, all of the technology that was in Freedom 7 had half of the technology that's in one of your smartphones. Not all of your smartphone, any one of your smartphones has twice as much technology as Freedom 7, just to put that in kind of context. But literally, the country was so transfixed that people got off the roads so that they wouldn't lose signal on their radio, and they listened to that. And that was in April of, that was May of '61. Then he delivered a few weeks later, President Kennedy, his joint address to Congress on that. Then John Glenn in February of '62 became the first American to orbit Earth. 17,500 miles per hour went up, and that stimulated, as we said, a lot of interest in STEM. Back then, about 20% of young people were studying STEM. Today, it's around 12 or 13%. So one of the things, think about how is our life controlled or impacted by technology then versus today? One of the things that I hope is that we reinvest in STEM, because clearly technology is a much bigger factor. And then when President Kennedy gave the Rice speech, you've seen a few seconds, but I'm going to show a slightly longer version of that now, if it's possible. We're going to jump ahead to that. And again, these are just...
We'll get back to the photos.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. But we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first. Before this decade is out, then we must be bold.
And when you think about this, in terms of being bold, I mean, it was brilliant just from a leadership perspective that he was clearly behind, the country was behind. And so his advisors said, if you're going to do micro steps, then we'll never catch up. So set a bold goal. And then we can, hopefully can catch up. The reality is, when you look at the documents, and as Larry said, a lot of these they're all open now. We've digitized a lot of them. A lot of them are on the documents and audio and video and stuff. They're on the website. We're doing more every day. When he gave this speech, the reality is he had no idea whether it would be successful. When you look at there's a recording 6 months after the speech with the then head of NASA, and the head of NASA is saying to the president, saying, do you think we're going to get there? Are we going to get to send someone to the moon and bring them back safely by the end of the decade? And 6 months after the speech, the head of NASA is saying, I don't know, Mr. President. I do know, because you have rallied the country, wherever we're going to get there faster. So thinking about a politician who is willing to put his reputation on the line for a big goal and rally people. And he did it both in Congress. He also spent time organizing some of the ticker tape parades, because he knew he had to organize people at the grassroots as well. So having that big, bold idea, I think our country needs more of those, whether it be the next mission to Mars, whether it be environment, whether it be medicine. You know, when we think about, for young people, when you think about countries or companies having big ideas today, what do they call them? They call them moonshots. Well, literally, this was the first moonshot. I also want to, before I make another point, while that speech was 55 years ago today, 64 years ago today, President and Mrs. Kennedy were married. So it's a particularly, September 12th is a particular significance for kind of those two reasons as well. Before I show kind of the last quick video, you think about why is this relevant today? Part of it is, again, I think that a discussion of should we, as students, as universities, as states, as countries, be thinking more boldly? And how does that affect us in different things? And if we're going to wait for all the information, he never would have made that speech. He never would have made that declaration. So to think about that. The second is all of the side benefits, as Larry mentioned. There are literally, you know, by this point, hundreds of things out there, GPS and de-icing of planes, and literally many, many, many other products that are side benefits of the space. And third is the impact on STEM, that I think we have to rededicate ourselves to that. And to think about that, I'm going to ask to end this short little video before we go to the, our real distinguished American hero. But 30-second video we've done to highlight the 100th anniversary of President Kennedy's birth.
Never before has man had such capacity to control his own environment, to end thirst and hunger, to conquer poverty and disease, to banish illiteracy and massive human misery. We have the power to make this the best generation of mankind in the history of the world.
That's wonderful. That was terrific in so many ways, and I'm glad that the young people here got to see that clip and also the earlier, longer version of President Kennedy's speech. How far we have fallen. How far we have fallen. And you know exactly what I mean, without my spelling it out. This is the third, you mentioned the second anniversary. And I'd forgotten about the marriage on this day, but the third was, which was critical to his election so he could do all of these great things, was the Houston ministerial meeting, which was 57 years ago today, when Kennedy went before a very grim group, very large, grim group of Protestant ministers who didn't like the idea of a Catholic becoming president, and who were convinced that if he did become president, as many of the cartoons at the time showed, some of them circulated in Protestant churches, that the first thing a President Kennedy would do every morning was to pick up the hotline, not to Russia, to the Vatican, to get his orders from the Pope. I mean, it's just laughable to think about something like this, but millions and millions of Americans believed it. Again, nothing's changed. There are millions and millions of Americans who will apparently believe anything. So that was a great moment as well. So this is a very significant day, three such days. So I'm thrilled that you mentioned that. But anyway, it's exciting, and all of you, and particularly the young people, it's worth a special trip to Boston just to go to the JFK Library and plan at least a day there, if not more than that, if you're going to really see and absorb the wonderful exhibits and other information there. That's living history. You really need to do it. Now, I'm happy to introduce our second distinguished guest, Dr. Thomas Marshburn, who holds a Bachelor of Science in Physics from Davidson College in North Carolina, which is fine. But his entire life changed, and doors opened, and there was celestial harmony when he achieved a master's in engineering in physics from the University of Virginia. After that, that's the key moment at which he knew his destiny. Now, apparently got a doctorate in medicine from Wake Forest, but again, it's PS really to to what happened here in Charlottesville. And a master's in medical, my goodness, you were busy. A master's in medical science from the University of Texas Medical Branch. You are very, very credentialed, and we appreciate that. Prior to becoming an astronaut, Dr. Marshburn served as a flight surgeon assigned to Space Shuttle medical operations and to the joint U.S.-Russian space program, and eventually became the medical operations lead for the International Space Station. Beginning in 1996, he served as a flight surgeon for NASA personnel deployed to the Cosmonaut Training Center in Russia. The Russians, huh? Okay, we're going to talk to you about that. Followed by work in the Center for the Flight Control, also in Russia, in support of the NASA 4 expedition to the Mir space station. In 1967, he became co-chair of medical operations for the Shuttle Mir space program. In 1998, he became the deputy flight surgeon for Neurolab and lead flight surgeon for the STS-101 mission to the International Space Station. So he's a veteran of 2 NASA space flights. He completed his first space flight in July 2009. The mission was accomplished in 248 orbits of the Earth, traveling 6.5 million miles, just over 15 days. In December 2012, he launched to the International Space Station as a flight engineer. The mission was accomplished in 2,336 orbits of the Earth and traveled almost 62 million miles. And that, I think, is about 2,600 more orbits of the Earth than anyone else in this room, probably everybody put together. Anyway, we're delighted that you would return to your premier alma mater, and we ask you please to share with us your wisdom.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have to say, thanks for the words prior to this, and just walking around campus, I'm reminded of being here as a graduate student, and I wanted to work for NASA. I wanted to be an astronaut, but who can get to be an astronaut? So I mostly wanted to work for NASA, but all the engineers I worked with also wanted to work for NASA and wanted to fly in space, and most of them were a lot smarter than me. I bring that up because it's, especially in an audience like this, I can say it, and I should say it more often probably. We talk about NASA spinoffs, why go to space? We don't talk enough about that kind of immeasurable motivation that doing something really hard, like going into space, inspires people to do. All of those people ended up being great engineers coming from here, ended up doing great things. Many of them probably lost interest or for whatever reason did not become astronauts, but they definitely gave back to society because of their interest that was initially motivated by their interest in space. I wish we could talk about that more. The other thing is, I forgot, in JFK's talk, he talks about before this decade is out, so deadlines really matter. Mike Griffin was the head of NASA, and he said that. He said deadlines matter. He was working with the post-Columbia, the space shuttle that broke up on reentry. Some close friends of mine died in that. As a result, there was tough to get the country motivated to actually be able to certify that next shuttle to go up, saying, is this going to be safe enough? Why are we doing this? And so Mike Griffin said, we are going to fly the next shuttle up here. We're going to recover the space shuttle program because deadlines do matter. Otherwise, it'll just kind of peter out. So I've got a video here, and if we could start with that. I was in the Space Shuttle 127, which was actually the 127th shuttle flight. My apologies, the audio is not on this track. But that's myself with my 6 crewmates. We're delivering cargo, supplies, and a human being, Tim Copra, to the space station. There we are on the flight deck. I'm in the mid-deck, so my great view of flying into space was that locker right in front of me. I'm in the far side there, sitting on my back. Julie Payette, who is about to become Governor General of Canada here in about a week, or a couple of weeks, was a crewmate. That is our shuttle Endeavour. So we're launching, note those Space Shuttle main engines, the most efficient chemical engines ever built on Earth, and remain so. We're getting ready to bring up tons and tons of cargo to the space station. Our job is to resupply it, both stuff on the inside and do spacewalks and carry things to the outside. I had the opportunity with my career after this flight, about 6 months later, I was reassigned to start training in Russia, in Star City, Russia, to fly on board the Soyuz spacecraft. So after this shuttle flight, we're doing a real pretty pirouette to take a look at the tiles from the space station. Space station crewmates are photographing it to make sure we can return safely to Earth. But I found myself a couple of years later in Kazakhstan and getting ready to launch off the same launch pad that Yuri Gagarin launched off of. So here we are sitting on top of the Soyuz. It's an ICBM basically. This was in 2012, the end of 2012. You know, when you're going from 0 miles an hour on the Earth to 17,500 miles an hour in orbit, it kind of feels the same. You're doing it in 8.5 minutes is how long it takes to get to orbit. As a matter of fact, that just happened today, about an hour and a half ago. A new crew just launched for the International Space Station. And here in the Soyuz, this tiny place we're all crammed in there, that was the staging, kind of a rough ride compared to the shuttle, but still it gets us to where we need to go. And there's a crew right now, they don't have that view yet, but they will in just about an hour have that view of the International Space Station. So we're going to do a real quick tour of the inside of the space station. This is a couple of years old, but it still looks just like this. It's kind of a strange aquarium of parts and spacesuit parts. Looking into the airlock, we were prepping ourselves to do spacewalks to set up the outside of the space station with supplies. We knew at this time the space shuttle program was going to be ended in 2011. Right now, the space station, about 30% of the volume is Russian. All of those are Russian vehicles, totally different feel and flavor on the Russian side of the space station, which actually adds a lot to the variety. We fly back and forth. We share meals together with our Russian counterparts. There are 6 people on board the station, almost at all times. And there's always US and Russian crew members up there. So right now in long-duration space flight, one of the legacies of the space station is that we're showing that people can live for long periods of time and end up being very healthy when they get back. One of the reasons for that is we've developed this exercise hardware. We spend about 2.5 hours every single day doing this resistive exercise, the treadmill, the cycloergometer that you saw there. This has led to a much greater understanding of how to prevent osteoporosis. Astronauts are in this accelerated aging program when we're in space, atrophy, muscle and bone atrophy, and we've been able to overcome that. We don't have running water on the space station, so if you're going to get yourself cleaned up, you got to have just wet wipes and water all around. But still, we start our day, usual day up there, just like you do on Earth. You brush your teeth there by the bathroom and get ready to go to work. We work about 14 hours a day in a laboratory. I can say that the work is absolutely delightful, and you can see why. The weightlessness aspect is an absolute joy, but it is also great frustration. All the hard things on Earth are easy in space. You can push 200 pounds effortlessly, but the easy things are hard. You can't find a place to put your coffee, for instance, or your pen, or anything like that. So you see astronauts floating around with stuff in their teeth and in between their legs and their hands all filled up. I'm making breakfast in the galley. The galley is basically just a box that's in one of the walls of the laboratory on board the space station. I think you can tell what that is. That's scrambled eggs. Yeah, it's awesome. It says it on there. It's really good. Looks great. About 1/3 of our food is dehydrated, and actually the food group has won awards and been giving talks around the country how they are able to provide food of this quality to crew members without using so much salt, because that's the preservative that they often use in store-bought foods, pre-prepared foods. Launch and landing are very dangerous, and so are spacewalks. Those are the 3 things where the humans are most at risk while living on board the space station. I've had the chance to do 4 spacewalks. Since that time, crew members have come back, and they brought GoPros out with them. So I want to share some of the videos with you. Not only, in my mind, is it stunning, but it's a great way to show the engineering magnificence of these spacesuits. They're really little miniature spacecraft. They have everything a spacecraft can do. You can even go to the bathroom in them, maybe not on a good day, but you can certainly do that. There's no food. That's the only thing you can't have. But we have about 32 ounces of water, and that's our sustenance when we go out, and oxygen for about 9 hours of work. You can see this large solar array panel. The space station is the largest power station that's ever been built and put put into orbit. For that reason, we can run an entire laboratory to include something like a particle detector, which is up there on the space station. And Ting, who is a Nobel Prize winner, is continuing to work on, with the alpha magnetic spectrometer, work on evidence for the existence of dark matter using this particle detector on the space station. Dangerous endeavor, though. You saw that cable. This is Shane Kimbrough doing a spacewalk outside that he had with him. You don't want to let go, or you'll go flying away. So, but that cable would keep us safe. We just might be famous if we punched a hole in one of those solar arrays. So it's definitely not something you want to do. Let go. For me, though, in this shot in particular, coming back into the airlock after your spacewalk, it was stunning to me to realize this entire complex, the size of a football field, is not attached to anything. It's going around the Earth, 17,500 miles an hour. Now, what we do up in space almost all of the time, about 14 hours a day, is science. That is the purpose. The space station is one of the U.S. national laboratories. So I was personally involved in about 300 experiments, a lot of those on me. I was the subject. But right now, another unique aspect for NASA is we're trying to get commercial companies interested in doing work on board the space station. Nanoracks is a company that can launch its own satellites once it comes up with the cargo to the space station. You've heard about private companies that have built rockets and spacecraft to resupply the space station. This crew of 3 is about to grab the Cygnus spacecraft. Orbital ATK is the company that's built it. They built the rockets to put it up there. And what we do with our robotic arm as crewmates, as crew members, grab the spacecraft and dock it to the space station so we can get the supplies. That was SpaceX, a cargo vehicle. And next year, probably they're going to be launching a crew. That's the plan, at least, to launch a crew to the space station. And so I think in about 5 years, you'll all be able to buy tickets. If you've got the money, at least that is certainly their goal for increasing access to space for everyone. So inside the, I have to throw it in, Boeing is doing the same thing with their Starliner. So there will be some competition there. So Chris Hadfield, he's an international YouTube star. You might recognize the face. He was my crewmate, station commander at this time. We are resupplying the vehicle, bringing back mostly experimental results. It's the work up there is just vibrant and active. You're talking to people all around the world. This is, for instance, an experiment in fluid physics. The device that was built to monitor this fluid broke, so the astronauts pulled out and came up with an ingenious way to film how fluids operate in space. New discoveries have been made in engineering models of how fires propagate, which was a big surprise to everyone. This is one of my favorite experiments. It's a capillary fluid flow experiment, which, although used, it was built to look at how we can have pumpless fuel tanks in space, ended up being extremely useful for the development of medical devices, miniature medical devices. We have grown plants in space. We've eaten them. A lot of medical tests that are done up there. There's a new syndrome where it affects astronauts in their eyes, which has opened the door a lot for a better understanding of idiopathic or unknown causes for headache. We are doing ultrasounds up there, which has expanded the role of ultrasound in remote medicine on the Earth for diagnostic imaging. And we're able to draw blood, take tissue samples, collect our urine, send it back to Earth for an enormous number of studies that continue to be done. So, but one of the aspects of flying in space is the view of the Earth that makes, really, in my mind, makes living up there so life-changing and enjoyable. This is not Harvey or Irma. This was taken a couple of years ago. But we can do disaster assessment and provide video and photos to the ground to assist with disaster response. This is the Alps at sunset. And what you're seeing is about what it looks like looking out the window of orbital velocity 250 miles up. And that's what it looks like to go 17,500 miles an hour. There's the aurora borealis, slightly sped up there so you can see the movement. And so here's Europe. The bright splotch on the left is London. Paris is on the right. We're coming up to Eastern Europe. You can see some lightning on the horizon. But all good things have to end. This is at the end of our 6-month stay. I missed quite a number of things, most notably my family, shower, and pizza. But we were in that order. And climbing into the Soyuz, you'll see how packed the Soyuz is. About the size of a Gemini spacecraft, smaller than the Apollo craft, but the most reliable and safest way into space that humans have ever devised. So here we are, undocking from the space station. We're going to fire our rockets to fall back through the Earth's atmosphere. And what you're going to see is us falling through the atmosphere and the view out the window, about 5,000 degrees out the window. That's why we have heat shields, to keep us protected. That heat actually burns up the window, fortunately not through it. But we were able to survive that, and then a parachute opens. And in the Russian program, we have thump downs. So that is about a 20-mile-an-hour car crash when the Earth rises up to meet you when you come home. I think it's a testament to the continuation of Kennedy's vision that we are at this point able to put people up into space. Scott Kelly for a year, regularly people for 6 months at a time. Peggy Whitson just came back, who is the U.S. All-time record holder, 665 days in space cumulative now. And yet we were able to stand up, we were able to work, we were able to operate. There's no question from the human standpoint we can get to Mars and work effectively and be healthy when we get there and when we return home. So let's step forward a little bit, just a quick few minutes here on what NASA is building for the future. This is, you might recognize those. This is a digitally rendered video. Those are Space Shuttle main engines, flanked by solid rocket boosters, just like the Space Shuttle. But on top is the Orion spacecraft. That in early 2020s is going to be bringing a crew of 4, up to lunar orbit again. And from lunar orbit, we'll continue to build and to work and build a small station there. That was an internationally developed, European-developed booster stage coming off there. And here we are coming around the limb of the moon and going to be returning to Earth. A little segment here on the re-entry because this heat shield for the Orion and for the Apollo were one of the reasons why we won the space race with the Soviets at the time. We were able to withstand the 25,000 mile an hour impact coming back into the Earth's atmosphere and not burn up. It required a technology at the time, and we've advanced that technology, which we're testing out now, to make sure we can withstand that heat on re-entry coming in. I've had the opportunity, riding in the Soyuz, of going through the stage where the drogues pop off, you free fall again, and then the next chute opens up. Here we go for another Yahoo moment. That's actually we call it type 2 fun. It's the kind of fun that you think is fun after it's over. But astronauts love that kind of stuff. So, and then you'll notice we're going to be going back to the splashdown, as is some of the commercial providers. Some will land on land, some will land on the ocean, in the ocean. And this is the end of the video here. But I thought it'd be worthwhile to just talk a little bit about what the US's plans are in early 2020. I will state that these are not PowerPoint slides or just digitally rendered videos. These are actually being built at the Kennedy Space Center. There's one there that launched in 2015, came back, it went about 4,000 miles out in space, came back, and there's this black hulk of it sitting in the Kennedy Space Center. It was a very successful flight. And right next to it is the vehicle that's going to be going up next year, which is not going to have a crew in it, but also the vehicle that's going to have a crew of 4 in it. That's the intent, at least, in the early 2020s. I can talk just a little bit more. Let me just say, for NASA's planning, going to Mars, it has come back. So in 2030, with the current funding level we have for NASA, we can go back to Mars in the 2030s. And actually, the robots that have been going to Mars, those have all been precursors to the human flight, to better understand the Martian atmosphere, but also to give us more motivation to go there. We've discovered water there now, and so we as a human race know that there could very well be life on Mars, which could be, we think, one of the greatest discoveries humans have ever made. So that's the plan, back to Mars in 2030. I could talk about details of that in the Q&A if you'd like. I think in the next few years, however, though, the most exciting thing is the rise of the commercial companies so that all of us have access to space. All of us will be able to fly into space. It'd be pretty pricey tickets at first, but eventually Astronaut Corps, NASA, everybody hopes that the price will come down with the competition and we'll all be able to get access to orbit. Thanks very much.
Very impressive.
That was fascinating, inspiring. Maybe you've created another astronaut or two or three among the young people here. Well, older people too. I don't know. You know.
Yeah.
But I just thought that was terrific. I'm going to ask one question to get us started, and with this size crowd, I want to throw it open immediately to your questions. So be thinking of what you want to ask. Now, we focused obviously on President Kennedy. And President Kennedy, as you noted, made that bold declaration without having any idea whether it could actually happen, even close to his schedule. Amazingly, it did before, I guess 1970 actually would have counted as the end of the decade, but 1969 was even better. Had another president been there, or had President Kennedy not made that pledge, do you think we would have ended up going anyway? And if the answer is yes, how much longer would it have taken us? It's just a wild guess. You can't be wrong. That's the great thing about this question.
So I'll start it. I think we would have done it. It would have taken us a lot longer. I don't know whether it's another decade or whatever. That because of what the Soviets did, I think America could not do something. But I think this idea of fundamentally when you're in government, you think about whether it be as someone at a city council level, at a state level, at a national level, do they take bold decisions or do they kind of look at incremental things? Clearly, there are many areas where President Kennedy took incremental choices on different areas. But on this one is a bold one. And I think that was very courageous and, you know, based on what he knew. So I think we would have gotten there, would have taken years and years longer.
Actually, I agree with you. Yes, Tom.
I would suggest the same thing only because the only reason why we have commercial companies right now just getting into low Earth orbit is becoming, they believe, viable from a market standpoint. And the only reason why that's happened is NASA provided seed money and some technology to get them going. So hopefully that's all very successful. So I would suggest, it's just my opinion, that we probably wouldn't have done it even today until companies had found a market to do it. It's partly also because I would suggest that our risk acceptance today is less than it was then. We took enormous risks. We could have you know, bodies still on the moon right now. Because if you read about the events that actually occurred when people went to the moon, it would suggest that had we continued to go, we might have lost a crew up there. But one could speculate whether we're even capable as a nation to accept that kind of risk today.
And that's sad, but I think you're right. Well, look, let me open it up. I know a lot of you have questions, and Glenn has a mic. Do we have just one mic? All right, we'll have to go back and forth between the sides. Yes, sir.
How long is a trip to Mars would take? A year, 2 years?
Round trip would be 1,000 days. And the reason for that
Interesting words, isn't it? 1,000 days?
Yeah. And the reason for that is only 6 months to get there, 7 months. And we do that on the space station all the time. Problem is you can't go to Mars, do a quick hop out, grab a rock, and then come back home because the Earth's not going to be there when you take the trajectory back again. But if you stay there for about a year, a little more than a year, then all the planets are aligned just right so you can return back home. So 1,000 days with a long stay on Mars.
Was the Martian accurate?
As a matter of fact, the writer for that, he got a lot of advice from NASA engineers. It's all kind of group sourced. You know, he was writing his own, he didn't know anything about this stuff. He was just interested in it. And biologists and technologists and engineers from NASA, MIT, were informing him as he went because it was this fun project he had on there. So I think it's pretty darn accurate as to how we would do it.
So you have to get used to potatoes, really.
Yeah. Got to fly the potatoes.
Those of you who haven't seen the film need to see that
actually,
film.
what we learned from that is don't send Matt Damon. You may remember he was in Interstellar. He was and Saving Private Ryan. So
Yeah, no, you're right.
Idea,
He would be eliminated.
Yeah.
What else? Okay, yes.
I feel like today we have a lot of bold ideas, almost like, you know, inspirational video fatigue, or just bold idea fatigue. Like, nothing seems to quite stand out as much as that let's go to the moon moment. But I'm wondering, like, at that time, are we just looking back on that as the big moment that we all remembered it as? Was it seen as big of a declaration at the time?
Yes, it was. So actually, on this day, 55 years ago, the speech did not get as much national attention, but the movement absolutely did. You know, when you think about it, I mean, John Kennedy was only president for 1,000 days. And there were 3 or 4 big ideas. Peace Corps was another one of those that would same kind of capture the imagination. You know, Peace Corps, just to give you a sense, when he suggested it, Eisenhower referred to it as Kiddie Corps, because he thought having these young people go to these countries, and again, I know for young people it can be hard to imagine, no cell phone, no connection, no internet. So I recently talked to several of the Peace Corps folks from 1961. When you went over there, you were there. I mean, you weren't quite on the moon, but it almost in that sense. So yes, it was seen as big, partially in proactive, this vision, and partially in a defensive of what Russia was doing. One of the other interesting things is John Kennedy twice reached out to the Soviets to propose joint missions. So even though he was doing it to really keep America ahead, he also realized he didn't know how long he could capture the American imagination and the billions and billions were needed. At that time, it wasn't, they didn't get connected. Obviously, later with the International Space Station, he did, but he made some of those forays even back in those first few years.
You know, one other aspect of that, we looked, going back to May of '61 and further, to see what the reaction was. Did you have, since you didn't have, you know, cable TV, did you have a load of columnists and other, you know, people on Meet the Press or whatever saying, what a nutty idea, this is going to cost a lot of money, and there's no blueprint? Nothing, nothing. That's the difference with today. Within 24 hours, the pundits would have ripped an idea like this to shreds and would have made the president look like an idiot, you know, for proposing something like this. So it's interesting. Maybe today's better in some ways, but it's worse in other ways, and this is a good example of it. What else? Where's the mic? You got to get the mic there, fella. You got to get the mic from her. Okay.
So this question's for our UVA alumnus. In what ways do you feel that the Kennedy legacy is still alive amongst astronauts or within NASA? Is he talked about? Is he credited for the progress NASA has made?
There are pictures on almost every hallway, on every floor. It's almost embarrassing how much we continue to look at that. It has a mythological status within NASA practically, of that speech and Kennedy's legacy and achieving the moon. Most people see that as the high point of NASA. I would suggest that what we're doing today is perhaps not as spectacular, but there's been an undercurrent of brilliance in both perhaps politicians, but certainly administrators and engineers who have done incredible things building something like the space station. We've lived there 17 years now. We have had continuous human presence up there now. And so great things are happening. It's just not getting the same attention. But yeah, NASA really looks back to that time. We'd love to have another one of those moments.
There you go. You got the mic. Congratulations.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you being here to inform us and educate us about JFK and the space program. But you've mentioned young people a number of times tonight, and I'm curious if any of you have specific advice so that we can bring back some of that boldness and set some of those deadlines and actually achieve them, so that we're not just looking backwards forever on the great moments of the past, but actually forging some of them ourselves.
It's a great question.
So I think it is a great question. Really appreciate it. I'd say two things. One is, in your life, think about the other thing that President Kennedy is known for. I mean, many of them, but the astronaut your country can do for you. And ask what you're doing in your city, in your park, in your area, in terms of the impact you're having, and hold people accountable. John Kennedy, he was the first president to give live televised press conferences. His staff all recommended against it. Too dangerous, we're saying something wrong. He did 64 of them in less than 3 years, on average every 16 days. In 1962, there's an annual survey done by Roper. 75% of people trusted government. Last year is 19%. So learn how government works and get involved with it. Because I think fundamentally, if you understand how it works and get involved, and that could be literally what's happening in your community, in your state, in your country, run for office, whatever you decide to do, because literally my generation has clearly messed things up in some ways, and we need young people to get involved and to think very boldly. There's actually a friend of mine runs a private space company that's called Go Boldly. And I hope that all of you think about different ways in your realm, whether it be environmental issues, medical devices, technology, all kinds of things. We need you.
Who cares about press conferences when you have tweets? Tom, how would you answer his question?
The only thing I would add is it's easy to be a critic and an observer, and it's harder to get involved and take risks and put yourself in a position where you have to make decisions that have impacts, big impacts. And you find very quickly that there's usually no real easy answer to anything. What we as astronauts often tell students, and it's easier for me to tell students here because you're already accomplished, you're in a great university already, you're going to do great things. And the people that have done wonderful things in the space program loved it. They did what they loved. They had a vision and they had a passion, and that was what they ate and drank and breathed day to day. So if you're blessed with that, then go with it. Harder to say that to some high school kids because they all want to be singers and athletes. But here, nothing wrong with that. But here, certainly, being willing to take risks and doing something that you have a passion about, I think would be key to the nation's future.
Who's got the mic? Okay, there you go.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the beginning, Kennedy considered a flight to Mars. And I'm curious whether he was dissuaded from that by the expense or by technical issues, and were white papers outlining these matters presented to him, and do we have copies of such papers in the museum?
No, it was literally Jim Webb having a discussion with President Kennedy in the White House, just explaining in layman's terms for a brief period of time just how difficult it would be with 1960s technology to get to Mars and back, compared to the moon, which was extremely difficult on its own. And Kennedy was a very bright guy. You see, he actually read books. He read lots of books. When he was dressing in the morning, he read a chapter of a book while he was dressing. Not comparing him to anybody necessarily. So, it helps to be intelligent and to be aware of the rest of the world. And he got it very, very quickly. Leadership matters. Also, that answers your question. Leadership matters. It matters a lot. And when you pick wisely, you benefit. And when you pick stupidly, you suffer. Sorry.
Without commenting about anybody. I really wish he was more outspoken, don't you?
Yeah.
I mean, just to follow up quickly on that, so many of those conversations actually, President Kennedy recorded 264 hours of those conversations. They're all public. We've digitized many of them. We're still digitizing more. So there are many of them. You can go to the website and you can listen to literally some of the conversations with the head of NASA, Reverend King, or others. You could literally do from your computer when you go home tonight.
You'll get hooked. Just do it once, you'll get hooked.
And the ones you don't, come to the library, and they're all free, and you can go to the research room and listen, spend 264 hours listening to them.
Dr. Hanks, did I see your hand up? This guy absolutely should ask a question.
Well, I want to compliment you on your medical degree. While you got short shrift for some of the other degrees, I was wondering, you gave such a very positive relation with the Russians in space. And we live sort of day to day on a lot of other fields dealing with the Russians. And is there any interest in expanding either science, scientific discovery, and other programs building on your experience with the Russians? Because it seems to me as you read about this that they're much like us, intellectually inquisitive, science-based, technologically savvy. How can we build on the successful space cooperation?
Yeah, so just with the recording, how can we build on the successful U.S.-Russian cooperation? And you're right. just living up there, I spent Christmas up there with my Russian colleagues, and we would talk about what our families do around the holiday season. There's so many similarities. There's a lot of strong bonding that goes on there. And I will say, because I know people are curious, how are relations now that U.S.-Russian relations are a little more strained perhaps today? And when it comes down to living in space, 6 people, and survival, you are absolutely reliant on your crewmates to stay alive up there. The relationship is wonderful, and it is throughout training on the ground. There might be some hassles getting through, through customs getting into Russia. We make about 10 trips over there throughout our training period, but the relationship is wonderful. So we have expanded our science relationship, getting our U.S. investigators together with the Russian investigators. So we are doing, might sound kind of strange, but we were doing separate science programs for a while there. Now we're mixing them up. We're traveling over in the Russian segment, sharing data back and forth. And my understanding is that the State Department is very interested in increasing that relationship. When it comes to going to the moon and Mars, there's the Europeans that built that 3rd stage. You saw the digital video there. While we're still working that out, it will probably be whether we land on the moon again or just stay in the orbit and then go on to Mars is to be determined, but it'll probably be an international effort. Not just because it's a good idea, but also because for our relationships, but also just from a monetary standpoint. These are expensive endeavors. Does that answer your question?
I guess it does, yes. But given sort of the fractured relations over here with, say, the current president, would something happen there that might threaten?
I imagine it's possible that the relationships on the Earth could affect things. What's, in my mind, in my opinion, spaceflight, because it inspired me so much, I think it's true for a lot of people. And sometimes that exploring the universe can transcend relationships here on the ground. It certainly appears to be happening with the International Space Station.
Who has the mic? Okay, good. There you go.
Thank you very much for coming out and speaking today. One opinion that has been mentioned in the past is that, and I think Buzz Aldrin has also espoused this at some points, is that NASA and the United States should not return to the moon and instead go straight to Mars, because going back to the moon would have us stuck there for 30 or 40 more years. So do you think that we should go instead to Mars and skip the moon, or should we go back to the moon and then Mars, or what is your opinion?
So my job is to implement the program that I'm assigned to. There are a lot of smart people. So yeah, exactly. But in truth, we talk about this in the astronaut office all the time, and we truly don't have the data to know. We would love to go back to the moon. I'll never go there, or certainly not to Mars, but maybe some of my crewmates, we just had a new class that came in. I know that they would love to go to the moon and walk on it. You could learn a lot on the moon that might be applicable as you're getting ready to go to Mars. Certainly there's that fear, though, that the public gets tired of that and we end up not going back to Mars again. So everything you mentioned is what I hear discussed. And so there currently is no plan to land on the moon. Maybe that's to maintain that target on Mars. And we will be spending a lot of time orbiting the moon, because there is a plan to start building a Mars ship in lunar orbit. There's a lot of physics reasons why it's cheaper from a propulsion standpoint to build things in lunar orbit and then boom, head out to Mars from there. So they're going to be tied together for sure.
You learn things. I'd never heard of that. That's fantastic. That's fascinating. All right, who's got the mic? Okay, there you go. You got to get over here. Some of these people want it too.
My wife and I have signed up for the Spot the Station alerts so that we can see the International Space Station when it goes over, and we're always amazed at how bright it is. Approximately how much candle power is given off by that thing when it's out there?
Well, let's see. I have to do some calculations here. I don't know. I don't know, but the solar arrays are one of the reasons for that. So it is incredibly bright when you're going over there. You mentioned that you're surprised you could see the Sputnik. It was, about a little bit bigger than a grapefruit, but it was shiny. And one of the reasons why it was shiny is so everybody could see it. Small things reflecting the light, and therefore very large things, shiny things, can be seen as well. So sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Thanks a lot for stumping him.
Yeah.
I mean, really. Okay. Now, oh, there you go. Finally, we got somebody over there.
My name is Edgar Gunter. I'm actually Professor Emeritus of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering here. I had the privilege of working with NASA for 4 years on the Space Shuttle engines. So I got a chance to travel to Houston, to Cape Canaveral, watched a number of engines being run and also blown up. So it was a big effort to get the engines fixed so that they were stable. A major disappointment to me was to see us stop our shuttle program and to rely on the Russian engines. And the epitome of that was Aerojet going to Russia to buy the NK-35 engine, which was used in the Russian space program. They blew up. They were so bad, they were supposed to be destroyed. Instead, they put them in storage in Siberia. Aerojet found out about them and bought them for $7.5 million each. They then sold them to SpaceX, and they put them on the rocket that was in Wallops Island, which blew up. The same problem. When we tried to analyze these, they said, oh no, it's classified. We won't show the drawings of this. So what my contention is, by giving up the design of NASA of engines, we lose that technology. When we privatize the building of these rocket engines, that data does not get out to our engineers. So I'm very concerned about privatizing space and NASA losing its technology. Because one of the things that NASA did, everything we wrote, they published it. So we got a tremendous amount of engineering information out due to NASA with open publications. So that is my concern, was for NASA to give up developing its own technology and the engineers that go along with it. I might add, the reason I'm here is because of the Russians. When they put up Sputnik, we had a National Defense Fellowship which put me to college. And here I am, thanks to the Russians. So,
Great point. You have a comment?
Oh yeah, it was Orbital ATK, Orbital, that actually had that engine that blew up on Wallops Island. SpaceX is building their own engines, but correct me if I'm wrong, but SpaceX, Air Force, and the Russians are only 3 that are building them right now. And so, yeah, there's a lot of Russian engines that are still being used out there. And you're right, what's that? That's true, yeah. Blue Origin, and the Chinese have built some rockets as well, yeah. So there is, private companies are doing some work along those lines, but yeah, there's a dearth of good engines. It's extremely difficult to build rocket engines that don't blow up on the pad. Yeah.
Who's that? Who's got the mic? Okay, yes, right here.
I think we were bold because we were very afraid of the whole thing with the Soviets and all. But the comment that you made about some risk aversion and sending men to the moon still, how much of that, as opposed to a budgetary thing, was behind the scrubbing of the last 3 Apollo flights?
I mean, it's probably both. I mean, you would know better. The Vietnam War was up, as well as just the expense of continuing the program.
I always assumed that it was more of a monetary thing, but yeah. I had
So I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that, I mean, I remember at the Vietnam War, there were posters of astronauts on the moon, and it said, so what? And what they're going to impact, and looking at the budgetary impacts of that. So I know there was, as part of the national debate at that time, but I don't know behind the scenes.
So I'm forgetting now the cost of the Apollo program from a percent standpoint in the federal budget. Right now, NASA is less than 1/2% of the federal budget. So, and during the Apollo program, it was several times that, but still in the single digits, I believe, in percent of the federal budget. So, my opinion is that national will is one of the greatest barriers or motivators for continuing.
Look at the Gallup records on that. The public interest and therefore commitment to spending money in NASA declined steadily, dropping off heavily at the end of the 60s and then dropping even farther and faster during the early 1970s. I think Vietnam was part of it, but part of it was the public got bored with it. It was, it seemed like the same thing in another canyon, every few months. And the interest level went up after Apollo 13. I guess disasters, attract attention. But Nixon was also responsible. He personally cut the last three, I believe. The last
Skylab
three.
too. Skylab too,
Yeah,
yeah.
Skylab as well. So
But,
again, leadership matters.
I
Leadership matters.
do believe that we are about, in 2 years to 5 years from now, a complete change in transportation, human transportation, with these private companies coming up. There will be a new renewal of interest. SpaceX, I've been there. I haven't been to where the Starliner is being built for Boeing, but I'm sure it's true there too. Young people, straight out of school, they're brilliant, they're working hard, they're working more than 100 hours a week. It's almost like the Apollo program in a miniature version in each of their factories. So I think when that comes out and we start flying, they start flying people into space, there's going to be a renewed interest that'll be just immense.
Who's got the mic? Okay, over here. Yes.
Thank you all so much for speaking tonight. And you actually got a bit to where I was going with my question, which is, if you look at the polls, I think the only month where a majority of the American public ever supported the Apollo program was the month of July 1969, where we landed on the moon. And so how do you think we work on that for any kind of future crewed space flight? Like, people already think like NASA's a waste for a much smaller budget, and NASA, I think lots of people would say, has done a really good job actually in the modern era of using social media to kind of like leverage its publicity in really powerful ways, but it's still always on the chopping block.
I think I'll follow up what Larry said, that leadership matters, that there are presidents of, on both parties. When George Bush did PEPFAR, AIDS in Africa, he made a concerted effort and he invested money and awareness in that area. I think there are great examples on both sides of the aisle of presidents and other leaders who have really stepped up in terms of going forward. So I think if you think about the next several years, whether it be going to Mars or someone going to say we're going to tackle the climate change, or Biden has a quote a cancer moonshot. I think any of those, I think we have to have a leader who can capture the imagination. There has to be an integrated set of media as part of it. We have to be willing to invest significant dollars. But part of it relates to underlying trust in government. As I said earlier, it's gone from 75% to 19%, and that was before the recent election, and a few things happened there that may have had an impact on trust. So that I think we have to find a more fundamental thing. I think that kids aren't learning about civics in school. Only 26% of students know there are 3 branches of the government, and 10% think Judge Judy is on the Supreme Court. More people can name American Idol than they can their senators, Congress people, or who the vice president are. So I think if they don't understand that, then you see some of the things that someone might say, and they say, well, that doesn't make sense. So I think we have to teach more about that, engage at every level, and then set some ambitious goals. And it's not just the president, because he or she, hopefully someday it'll be he or she in terms of having opportunities, but at every level. I mean, think about what the city council is going to do in this city with what's happening now. Think about what state's happening. So I think at every level, it's up to all of us to do that. And I've seen in my lifetime lots of leaders on both parties who have really made an enormous impact. President Kennedy is one, but there are others as well.
The UVA Center for Politics, #1 goal, more and better civic education. That's what we spend our money on. Hint, hint. I don't think I have to pass out contributor cards, do I? Okay. Where do we have the mic?
Let me just add one thing to that.
Yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I think it'll be really interesting if China or Russia decide to go to the moon. And that could change everything. Because I think we as a nation treasure those videos of seeing Buzz Aldrin bounce around on the moon. And the decade of the 60s, there's always that video as a major accomplishment during that time. And I think we treasure it, and we may want to get back into competition if they decide to go.
So get our competitive juices flowing.
Perhaps.
What if they decide to go to Mars? I guess the same thing would
Same thing,
happen, right?
I suspect.
Yeah.
We'll send Matt Damon.
Yeah. We'll give them Matt Damon. Okay. Who's next? Yes, sir.
In the video you show like a lot of fancy things and like great things about the space station, but it's going to retire anytime, like in the next decade or so. Do you know what's the exact plan NASA may have with ISS, like say 2024?
Yeah, the 2024 is when the international commitments are done. And so what happens to the space station after that, whether it's deorbited, Private companies take over, other countries take over it. Whether NASA changes its plan, all that could happen, but right now it'll retire in 2024, the U.S. involvement.
So what's the plan as for now, after 2024?
So for after 2024, we'll continue with the Orion vehicle with continued flights up into lunar orbit and begin building a craft that'll be going to Mars.
So right now, NASA has no idea what the actual station could be after 2024.
Well, I mean, it's a robust station. It'll probably continue to exist exactly like it is if someone takes over. I don't know what's in work for private companies or for international partners to take over it. But they are developing a very good plan for deorbiting it. It's not something you can forget about and walk away from because it will fall out of the sky, and that thing is way too large to allow it to do it without a lot of planning at a time. In my opinion, it would be too bad if that happens, obviously, but somebody will need to continue to fly up to it and maintain it.
All right, we're going to have 2 more questions, and then we're going to go to our reception. So somebody has picked somebody. Oh, here we go.
Two quick questions about China. One, are there any negotiations, contacts between NASA and China, the Chinese space program? I know they've been reluctant. I know Charlie Bolden went over there once. Is there anything ongoing there? And
Not that I know of, actually, no.
Okay, and 2, a political question on China. What would the American people think if one of those Apollo flags ended up on display in Beijing?
Well, go ahead. You can I can answer the political
Please,
one, but you answer the other one. But what do I think would happen? We'd take it back. That's what I think would happen. And how we'd get it, I don't know. Probably one of our billionaires would buy it. That would be my guess. That's the easiest way and the most peaceful way to do it. Don't give them any ideas. That's my suggestion.
They're flying what? They're flying 2 modules? Are they still there on?
No, their space station is, I believe it has deorbited. It went out of control, but they did have at least 2 or 3 successful flights.
First one lost control, this has not deorbited, and the second one's in space.
The second one's yeah. But they've done a spacewalk, they've lived on board there, so yeah.
What was the other question? That was a 2-part question. Okay, there you go. Here we go.
I don't know how classified this is, but what are some cool things you found while you were researching space?
Doing research in space?
Yeah, like what are some of the cool discoveries, I don't know, or potential things?
Just tell us, we won't tell anybody else.
Okay.
Yeah, you can trust everybody in here.
And don't worry about that video.
So, so as a physician, one of the coolest things was I showed that quick video of the capillary flow. It turns out that picoliter volumes of fluid on the Earth act just like big mega volumes of fluid in space. So a lot of the studies that they have done and are continuing to do have informed engineers who've been able to build more efficient lab-on-a-chip devices to take entire laboratories, put them on a chip, and I know there's some patents out. They want to develop a small handheld device that can detect HIV and bring it out to remote places in Africa. There's a lot of understanding. There's a furnace up there. They've been able to develop new alloys for new materials, some liquid metals as well. Has been used in various products around. Well, I almost don't know where to stop. There's a lot of telescopes on the outside of the space station that are brought up by these cargo vehicles and then put on the outside. There's an enormous amount of increased understanding of algal blooms, ocean currents, aerosol mixtures in the atmosphere that give us a better understanding of what's happening with our climate and with the atmosphere. I mentioned the alpha magnetic spectrometer. Right now, they're finding out that there is an anti-proton-proton imbalance in the universe, which would point to dark matter or some new physics as causing that. We're learning a lot about bone muscle aging as well and how to prevent that. There's some rodent research going on right now, getting down to the genomic level and figuring out what actually causes osteoporosis. Some of the protein crystal growth been able to come up with some incredibly crisp, clear pictures of complex molecules. Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, they've been able to finally figure out what that looks like and develop a medication for that, as well as, and I have to mention, turns out microbes change up there as well. Gravity has something to do with that, with the cytoskeletal architecture of a microbe, so it, in one case, salmonella, it becomes extremely virulent. And so they're able to take that new strain of salmonella, bring it back, and develop a vaccine against salmonella. So it's almost like we're just on the beach of the continent of what we could find out up there. And stuff we never even thought we would ever be doing research on is turning out to be extremely interesting. I don't want to bore people. I could keep going on. So.
It's not boring at all, but just listening to you, and I like to think I'm fairly informed. I try and keep up with a lot of things, not your field necessarily, but NASA would get a lot more support if more people knew about the things that you just described. I mean, each one that you mentioned could be a NOVA program.
So these are all publications that are going out there. Part of the problem is the government cannot advertise itself, first of all. So there's a law against doing that. So aerospace companies do some advertisement. NASA has its own channel. They do have a public relations group, but there's a lot of competition out there with 24/7.
Public TV would be a good place to start, and then I would think some of the cable channels, they're always trying to fill time. Is there any way that these projects, these experiments can make Trump look good? Then it could get on Fox. And that's millions and millions of people. There are ways to do this thing.
Yeah, no one's found the magic key yet. But there's an enormous amount of work, obviously, a lot of interest in getting the word out on what's being
I'll give you an example of a very small project that we're doing with the International Space Station. So we have a website called Where in the World is JFK, identifying places around the world named after John Kennedy, schools, hospitals, bridges, etc. So far, we've identified 740 of these places. The International Space Station has mapped the world. And so we're getting a series of photos from 250 miles up of every place. We're going to put it on our website. And we're doing this, we're starting to do it with school children, accessing with a group called CASES that's working with the International Space Station. So we wanted to show kind of what the pictures they're taking involving students. So that's a tiny, tiny example of the amazing work that they're doing up there. It's really quite impressive.
Well, you don't get enough credit for it, and the public doesn't know about it. It really is civic education. That's the key to rebuilding support for a better funded space program, I think. But, well, I said that was the last question. Does somebody have something really quick? Because I don't think they're quite ready for us to come out. 8 o'clock, we're supposed to come out for food. So somebody's got something really quick. All right, we'll get you two. Two really quick things.
Am I next or the
You're
other?
next, you're next.
Okay. No, this is not a question. This is a joke. What I have learned from your adventures in space is that osteoporosis is a problem. And therefore, since I want to have as much weight bearing on my bones as I can, I should keep my weight up.
Muscular weight.
Okay, fortunately, that's not the last comment. Let me get this. This lady over here has it was okay, I mean, I have low standards for humor anyway.
I just want to say that the International Space Station does have an Instagram page, and the pictures that are on Instagram are just phenomenal. So if you are interested, it's a great one to.
And all the astronauts are tweeting from space as well.
I gotta get their Twitter.
I had 40,000 followers, but I stopped tweeting once I got back. I thought it was my regular life was way too boring. So.
Do you trust the fake news?
Yeah.
I mean, is that part of it? You're doing your own tweeting because you don't trust the fake news. Okay.
What is your regular life? Oh, a regular life astronaut? It's having a family is great. It's because I'm about three notches below the cat when I'm at home. But every day at work is different. I spend about 20% of my time training. I'm waiting for a reassignment. It may never come. I don't know. But we fly jets, we practice spacewalks, we are always in Russian class, and spend a lot of time doing those things. But otherwise, the majority of our time while we're waiting for a flight is spent helping others fly into space, providing all the support they need while they're up there, getting them ready to go, taking care of them when they get back. And that's where we spend most of our time in the astronaut corps when we're not actually training for a flight.
All right, last comment.
What does it smell like in the space station, and is it noisy?
So I thought it was going to smell like a men's locker room when I got there. And it didn't. It was pristine. It was great. We spent a lot of time cleaning it up, but the airflow is wonderful up there. It smells good. Crewmates actually do not smell bad up there, even though we just do wet wipe baths. We wear the same clothes for an entire week, and then that becomes our gym clothes for another week. We burn up our clothes after use. But overall, it smells great. You might see it on the internet that space smells like bacon. And what that is, when we pull people out of the airlock after they've done a spacewalk, there's some kind of ionization that goes on in the air or some radical oxygen species, I don't know what, but it smells like ozone. It smells, it almost is a kind of a sweet bacon smell. When they come out from space and come in and they're off-gassing, you know, still in that, all those molecules are still in the airlock. It's kind of interesting. That's all I got, though.
Wow. Never knew that.
Oh, and noisy. Yeah, if you have a lot of computers in your office and spend a day in your office, that's kind of what it sounds like. It is noisy because they have to have a lot of airflow, but we don't get any hearing problems from it. I would not be able to talk to you at all on board the space station. We'd have to be, Larry and I could have a conversation, but we'd be yelling to have a conversation up there. But it's not distracting, and there's certainly no harm to our hearing. They monitor that very closely.
Do you wear earmuffs at night?
No, some people do.
Oh.
Noise cancellation headsets, but no, I didn't.
Well, I live on the lawn, and I've got a lot of noise deafening machines I could lend you, you know, if needed. Look, this is, we hold a lot of events, and have held a lot of events on JFK. This has been absolutely one of the best because of Tom and Stephen. They have been fantastic. Please join me and thank you.
Good job. Really, thank you.
It's absolutely top flight. Top flight. As I said, top flight, and that's referring to the space. Okay, let's, I think we can, you feel free to come up and chat, but also there's food waiting for you in the lobby, and thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.